Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in gleaming chests, but in the forgotten corners of a life well lived. For Sarah, however, life felt less like a treasure and more like a debt that was finally coming due. The foreclosure notice, stark and official on her worn kitchen table, was a testament to a year of bad luck, a broken-down truck, and the relentless solitude of her small cabin nestled deep in the Appalachian hollow. Her grandfather, the man who had raised her on this very land, was gone, leaving behind nothing but memories, the weight of his absence, and a single, rust-pitted key. The key was her final inheritance, a prepaid receipt for a storage unit at the edge of town, its rent expiring in 2 days. The auctioneer called it a delinquent unit, a polite term for someone else's abandoned hopes. When the rusty roll-up door was cranked open to reveal a mess of dusty furniture and sealed boxes, nobody bid. Except for Sarah. With the bank's final warning echoing in her ears, she raised a trembling hand and offered the last $15 in her pocket. It was a desperate, illogical act, a final grasp at a connection to the man who had been her entire world. As the lock was cut and the door slid open just for her, a wave of musty air washed over her, carrying the scent of old wood, dust, and something else, something indefinable. It smelled, strangely, like hope. Her scruffy border collie mix, Buster, who had been her constant shadow through these hard months, darted inside, his nose twitching, already sensing something beyond the visible clutter. The inside of the unit was a chaotic jumble of a life packed away in haste. Old tarps covered lumpy shapes, stacks of yellowed newspapers leaned precariously, and boxes filled with canning jars stood silent guard in the corner. A wave of disappointment washed over Sarah. She didn't know what she had expected. A hidden savings account? A forgotten heirloom? Anything but this collection of what looked like pure junk. She sank onto an overturned bucket, the metallic groan echoing in the small space, and buried her face in her hands. The $15 was gone, and with it, the last flicker of a foolish dream. But Buster wasn't discouraged. He was whining, a low, insistent sound, his paws scratching at the side of a heavy, sea-worn wooden chest tucked away behind a stack of old tires. "It's nothing, boy," Sarah mumbled, her voice muffled. "Just more of Grandpa's junk." Buster, however, was relentless. He nudged her hand with his wet nose, then looked back at the chest, his tail giving a single, emphatic thump against the concrete floor. He was a smart dog, with an intuition that had guided them out of more than one tricky situation on the mountain trails. His certainty was a small spark in her despair. With a heavy sigh, she got up and ran her hands over the chest. It was solid oak, bound with iron straps, and secured with a heavy, salt-corroded padlock. There was no key. She spent the next hour working at the lock with a hammer and a rusty screwdriver from her grandfather's old toolbox, which she found lying nearby. Each clang of the hammer against the metal was a release of frustration, a blow against the bank, against her loneliness, against the crushing weight of it all. Finally, with a loud crack, the shackle gave way. The lid creaked open, revealing not gold coins or precious jewels, but another layer of disappointment. Inside lay a collection of geology hammers, a set of tarnished calipers, several oddly shaped rocks etched with strange symbols, and a stack of leather-bound journals. Sarah lifted one of the journals, its cover soft and worn from years of use. The pages were filled with her grandfather's familiar, spidery handwriting. It wasn't a diary of daily events, but a log of observations, sketches of rock formations, and complex geological diagrams. She flipped through the pages, a sense of profound intimacy washing over her. This was the man she knew, the quiet, thoughtful observer who had taught her the names of the trees and the secrets of the streams. But as she read, she found passages that were different, more personal, filled with a sense of urgency. He wrote about the hidden heart of the mountain, a secret he felt compelled to protect. He described it not as a treasure to be sold, but as a stewardship passed down through their family. He spoke of its fragility, its importance to the health of the entire valley. It was more than rocks and minerals, it was a living thing. Buster rested his head on her lap, letting out a contented sigh as the afternoon sun slanted through the open door of the storage unit, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time in months, Sarah felt a flicker of something other than dread. It was curiosity. This was the real inheritance, she realized. Not money, but a mystery. A story. It's amazing what you can find in the forgotten corners of a place, isn't it? Just like here in the Blue Ridge Mountains, every hollow and hilltop has a story to tell. If you're enjoying this journey into our little corner of the world, make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next. Tomorrow, Sarah's going to find out she's not the only one interested in her grandfather's secrets, and things are about to get a whole lot more complicated. The next morning, Sarah carried the journals and one of the etched rocks back to her cabin. The foreclosure notice still sat on the table, a stark reminder of her reality, but it seemed less powerful now. She had a purpose. She made a pot of coffee and sat on her porch, looking out at the vast expanse of the mountains that had been her family's home for generations. She decided to pay a visit to Jedediah, her closest neighbor and one of her grandfather's oldest friends. Jedediah lived a mile down the dirt road, in a cabin that looked as old as the mountains themselves, with a porch full of rocking chairs and wind chimes made of old silverware. He was whittling a piece of wood when she arrived, Buster trotting ahead to greet him with a happy bark. "Morning, Sarah," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah smiled faintly and held out the rock. "Worse. I think I'm starting to understand my grandpa." Jedediah took the rock, his gnarled fingers tracing the carved symbol, a spiral intertwined with a depiction of a water droplet. His eyes, usually twinkling with amusement, grew serious. "I haven't seen one of these in 50 years, he murmured. "Your granddaddy called them story stones, said they were a map, of sorts." Before he could explain further, the sound of an engine, sleek and quiet, and utterly out of place on their rugged road, made them both look up. A polished black SUV pulled to a stop, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out, his city shoes crunching awkwardly on the gravel. He introduced himself as Mr. Thorne, a representative from a company called Apex Development. He carried a leather portfolio and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He offered Sarah a check for a sum that made her gasp, enough to solve all her financial problems, and then some. He said Apex was interested in her land for a small-scale geological survey. The words were smooth, but the offer felt like a threat. Sarah politely declined, the words tasting strange and new in her mouth. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about the money. She was thinking about the journals, about the stewardship her grandfather had written about. Thorne's smile tightened. He left her with a glossy brochure and a business card, adding, "The offer stands for 48 hours. After that, we may have to explore other avenues to acquire the survey rights. It would be a shame to involve the courts." The veiled threat hung in the air long after his SUV had disappeared down the road, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Jedediah spat on the ground. "Apex Development," he grumbled. "They're no developers. They're vultures. They've been sniffing around these mountains for years, trying to get their hands on the water rights." The pieces started to click into place. The journals, the story stones, the sudden, aggressive offer from a development company. It wasn't about the land itself. It was about what was underneath it. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. With a lamp casting a warm glow over the kitchen table, she spread out the journals, Buster asleep at her feet. She read for hours, piecing together her grandfather's life's work. He wasn't just a simple mountain man. He was a brilliant, self-taught geologist and ecologist. The journals were filled with meticulous data on water tables, mineral compositions, and the delicate symbiotic relationship between the geology and the biology of their valley. He had discovered a unique, crystalline mineral deposit deep within their land. But he wasn't excited about its monetary value. In his writings, he described how this mineral, which he called expiring, had a remarkable property. It acted as a natural, large-scale filter, purifying the groundwater that fed all the springs and wells in the surrounding area. The hidden heart of the mountain wasn't a mine. It was the source of the valley's lifeblood. Protecting it wasn't about hoarding wealth. It was about preserving the health of the entire community. He wrote about his fears, about corporations that would see only dollar signs and destroy the fragile ecosystem to get to it. He had spent the last 20 years of his life creating a fortress of information, a legacy of knowledge designed to protect it. The next day, as if on cue, Mr. Thorne returned. This time, he wasn't smiling. He strode onto her porch without being invited, his presence an invasion of her sanctuary. "Miss Miller," he began, his tone sharp and condescending. "I think you misunderstand the situation. We are not asking for your permission. We are informing you. Our preliminary aerial surveys indicate a significant mineral deposit on this land. A deposit you are clearly not equipped to manage." Sarah stood her ground, her fear replaced by a cold anger. "This land has been managed by my family for over a century," she said, her voice steady. "We've done just fine." Thorne laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your grandfather was an eccentric old man scribbling in notebooks. We are a multi-billion-dollar corporation with the best geologists in the world. We know what's here, and we will get it, with or without your cooperation." At the sound of his raised voice, Buster, who had been lying quietly by the door, rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Thorne took an involuntary step back, his composure finally cracking. "Control your animal," he snapped. "You have 24 hours to accept our final offer. After that, our legal team will proceed with an eminent domain claim for the purposes of resource development vital to the state's economy." He turned and left, the screen door slamming shut behind him. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a declaration of war. Sarah looked at Buster, who was still standing stiffly, his eyes fixed on the road. "He was right about one thing, boy," she whispered, stroking his head. "Grandpa was scribbling in notebooks, and I think he left me the perfect weapon." Fueled by coffee and adrenaline, Sarah and Jedediah spent the entire day hunched over her kitchen table. It was covered with her grandfather's journals, the story stones, and old county survey maps Jedediah had brought from his own collection. "He was clever, your granddaddy," Jedediah said, tracing a line on a map with a calloused finger. "These symbols on the rocks, they're not just decorations. They're markers. They correspond to landmarks. That big oak that got struck by lightning up on Ridgeback Point? That's this 1 inch." Slowly, painstakingly, they began to connect the dots. The journals contained partial maps, hidden within the margins of geological sketches. When they overlaid these scraps onto the larger survey maps, using the story stones as keys, a complete picture emerged. It wasn't a map to a treasure chest, but a detailed schematic of the mountain's entire hydrological system. It showed the location of the aquiferine deposit, but more importantly, it showed how the deposit was inextricably linked to a network of underground springs and aquifers that provided water for hundreds of families, farms, and ranches across 3 counties. Jedediah whistled softly. "They don't want the mineral, Sarah. They want the water. If they get control of this deposit, they control the source. They could drain it, divert it, sell it to the highest bidder. This whole valley would turn to dust." The $10 million secret wasn't the value of some rare rock. It was the value of the water, the life it sustained, and the entire community that depended on it. Tucked into the final pages of the last journal, Sarah found an entry that was different from the rest. It was dated just a few months before her grandfather passed away. He wrote, "They're getting closer. I can feel their shadows on the mountain. But I put my faith not in locks or laws, but in the land itself. I filed the old papers, the deed of stewardship. It's a long shot, an old bit of mountain law nobody's used in 100 years. But it's all I've got. It binds our blood to this soil, not as owners, but as protectors. Find it, Sarah. It's in the county archives, filed under the family name, the year the big flood came. It's our only shield." The next morning, Sarah drove her rattling pickup truck to the county seat, a 2-hour trip down the mountain. The county archives were in the courthouse basement, a dimly lit room that smelled of aging paper and floor wax. The clerk, a woman named Mildred with a formidable beehive hairdo, looked skeptically at Sarah's dirt-stained jeans. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she doubted it. "I'm looking for a land deed," Sarah said, her heart pounding. "An old one, filed under the name Miller. My grandfather said to look for the year of the big flood." Mildred sighed, but something in Sarah's determined expression must have moved her. She led her to a towering wall of dusty, leather-bound ledgers. "The big flood was 1947, she said. "Good luck." For hours, Sarah carefully turned the brittle pages, the silence of the room broken only by the rustle of paper and the distant hum of the building's ventilation. Her hope began to fade. Maybe her grandfather had been mistaken, or maybe the document had been lost to time. Just as she was about to give up, she found it. It wasn't a deed in the modern sense. It was a deed of stewardship, a legal instrument rooted in old conservation and land use laws, drafted and filed long before corporations like Apex Development even existed. The document, signed by her great-great-grandfather and witnessed by the county judge of the time, legally designated the Miller family as perpetual custodians of the land and its subterranean water resources for the explicit purpose of preservation for the benefit of the surrounding community. It predated Apex's corporate charters, state zoning laws, and any modern mineral rights claims. It was a shield, just as her grandfather had said. Armed with a certified copy, she drove back up the mountain, a sense of quiet triumph growing within her. When Thorne's black SUV appeared in her rearview mirror, tailgating her aggressively, she didn't feel fear. She felt ready. The confrontation happened at a town hall meeting that evening. Apex Development had called the meeting to present their proposal to the community, a slick PowerPoint presentation full of promises of jobs and prosperity. Mr. Thorne stood at the podium, exuding confidence, speaking of progress and the economic benefits of their planned extraction facility. He painted a picture of a brighter future, carefully omitting any mention of the water. The room was tense. Many of Sarah's neighbors were there, their faces etched with worry. They were farmers and ranchers, people whose livelihoods were tied directly to the land and the water that nourished it. Jedediah had spread the word, and the community had turned out to listen. When Thorne finished his presentation and asked for questions, a heavy silence filled the room. Then, Sarah stood up. She wasn't the same woman who had bought a storage unit with her last $15. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong. "Mr. Thorne," she began, "you've spoken a lot about minerals and jobs. But you haven't said a word about the water." Thorne's smile faltered. "The water is a secondary concern, fully manageable with modern environmental controls." "It's not a secondary concern," Sarah interrupted, walking toward the front of the room. "It's the only concern." She held up the certified copy of the deed of stewardship. "This document, filed in 1947, legally designates my family as protectors of the water resources on that land. Not for sale, not for profit, but for the benefit of every single person in this room. Your survey is invalid, your offer is irrelevant, and your proposal is a threat to our way of life." She didn't just present the legal document. She told them everything. She shared her grandfather's words from his journals, explaining the science, the ecology, and the legacy of protection he had fought so hard to create. She made them see that the mountain's heart was their own. A low murmur spread through the crowd, growing into a roar of support. Farmers stood up to talk about their wells. Mothers spoke of the clean water their children drank, and elders shared stories of the big flood and how the mountain had always provided for them. Thorne stood at the podium, his face pale, his polished corporate narrative completely dismantled by a story of family, community, and heritage. Faced with irrefutable legal precedent and the united, furious opposition of the entire town, Apex Development had no choice. Within a week, they officially withdrew their proposal and their legal threats vanished. The victory was quiet but profound. Sarah, with Jedediah's help and the support of the community, established a non-profit land trust, using her grandfather's research as its founding charter. News of the aquiferine mineral and its unique properties attracted the attention of a university's environmental science department, which provided a grant to study it, ensuring the trust would have the funding it needed to protect the land in perpetuity. The grant was more than enough to pay off the bank and secure her home for good. The foreclosure notice was replaced on her kitchen table by geological charts and conservation plans. One evening, as the sun set behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, Sarah sat on her porch with Buster resting at her feet. She held one of her grandfather's journals in her lap, its worn leather cover feeling like a familiar hand in her own. She had found his treasure, and it was so much more than money. It was a purpose. It was the clean air, the sound of the wind in the pines, the unwavering loyalty of a good dog, and the strength of a community that knew what was truly valuable. She had inherited not just a piece of land, but a legacy of stewardship. And as she watched the last rays of light paint the mountain in hues of gold and purple, she knew she was finally home.